My name's Dave Evans. I'm with Falling Squirrel Games, and we're making an all-audio game that's supposed to be a novel experience for sighted and blind people because it's fully blind accessible, and the name of the game is The Vale, and it's an action RPG with a medieval setting.
And can you give us, beyond the audio setting and the action, can you give us an overview of what the game is about?
From a narrative standpoint? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you play as a second in line to the throne character who's blind from birth and feels like as their brother is being anointed king, they're kind of shuffled off to the outskirts of the kingdom to lord over a castle there. And en route to the castle, a barbarian invasion happens, and you're basically left stranded 500 miles from home, and it's up to you to use your wits and combat skills and exploration to safely journey home again, to hopefully be part of the royal family.
How big is the team, and how far into development is this game?
We're a relatively small team. I'm the creative director and writer and lead designer. I also have a lead programmer on the team, and everyone else is sort of contracted, the professionals within the film and television industry, which is where I started. We're doing the sound recording and helping me put together the audio for the game. There are very few visuals in the game, so it's pretty much 3 full-time people working on this.
What platform is the game releasing on, and when do you hope for it to be released?
We're hoping for early next year release, and it's going to be coming out on Steam and itch.io in particular, because it's quite accessible for the visually impaired community that's looking forward to the game. And we're hoping that we might be out on other platforms as well, but that's the current plan.
And what are you hoping for people to take away from the game that see or play it?
I'd like people to appreciate maybe the novelty of the experience, but specifically that novelty revolves around the intimacy of the experience. So people in the sighted community will hopefully make up the majority of people who are enjoying this game. There's an incredible intimacy that comes out of the binaural audio setting, and contextually, because you're playing a visually impaired character, the world is very close to you, so you're not doing a lot of gameplay that's about seeing great distances or pulling in big vistas, which usually adventuring in, let's say, a game like The Witcher is about those big vistas and big spaces. We've kind of made that what might be considered a disadvantage. We made that an advantage in that the game is very centered around intimacy, that everything's about the details and sound immediately around you, and a credible amount of fidelity in that sound. And that's what most people describe as being novel. It's intimate, and it's and people are getting like, what do you call it? Describing having chills and stuff, because there's a very visceral response to that.
I gotta ask, what was it like building this game space that you really can't see? What was it like building that world around a character that you kind of have to create solutions to be able to handle through feedback from the controller or from oral experiences? We sort of approached the development of this game from a traditional standpoint. We're using Unity, and we're building this place in 3D space, and I can see the objects as I place them. But then there's a whole second process where we have to go and understand what that feels like. And as I was saying before, this idea of intimacy and detail is important. So the environments are built out of little details in the environment. And one thing we found in testing is that it was important that every detail in the environment had an interactable element. I remember early on in production, I put in as an atmospheric effect a cathedral bells in the background, and I got a lot of feedback from the community who was testing the game as to why can't I get to the cathedral. So I realized everything needs to have some sort of interactive representation. So even chickens and sort of livestock sound effects in and around the space you're playing in. When you walk through them, you hear the chicken fly away and stuff like that. So everything everything happened, whereas you wouldn't. Or sorry, what happened was everything ended up being about. Every sound is an individual event rather than creating like a mix, which is what you would traditionally do in a lot of games, is a mix, a soundscape. I actually had to build a world with sound.
It's mentioned on one of the features that this is fully blind accessible. Have you had the opportunity, or do you intend to test this with blind players?
Yes, from the very beginning of this project, or the very, very beginning, I embarked on this as a way to use my strengths to create a game cheaply. So I'm not an artist. I directed voiceover and I write narrative. So I thought, oh, this would be a good medium to work in, but very quickly I realized that this would have a lot of significance to the blind community. So I partnered with a organization called the CNIB, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, and from the very beginning they've been setting up focus testing sessions where I've been bringing the community in to play the game, and a lot of their comments are just about being gamers. It's not from a specific perspective, but I have a lot of confidence that I'm going to honor what they want in this game, and the things that they don't have traditionally in video games. It'll be there because it's driven a lot by what they would like to see in video games, which really comes down to having experiences similar to everybody else.
Through your focus testing, is there any particular challenges that you've discovered with this game that you might not have known about, being the fact that you can see clearly, and that were brought to your attention by the focus testing with blind players? Yeah,
no, for sure. There was a lot of things we realized right away. I'm trying to think. A lot of these were perspectives that I think anybody could have had, but I happen to be working with this community. Like, for instance, the idea that if you're surrounded by enemies, there's a limit to how many enemies I want surrounding you. My initial idea for this game was that I could have 10 people surrounding you and you'd be able to pinpoint where they are. But it's not really the way sound works. You can get a general sense of where things are. So I realized that I had to be much more careful with that, also because people hear sound differently. That was another thing I was a little bit surprised with. People hear binaural audio differently. So I had to make sure that it sounds great, but ultimately I had to simplify the directional aspect of the game down to basic slots. So that was one big thing. But probably the biggest thing that came out of the community, which is something I touched on earlier, was that there was a huge desire in the community to have every sound represent some point of interaction. And again, I wasn't expecting that to be as important as it is. So these worlds had to be deep, but they also needed every sound had to honor an interaction. If I think of it, I know there's a whole bunch of other things that we've discovered in testing this with the blind. Oh, actually, I got one other good story on this. One thing, an assumption I had made early on was the importance of the haptic feedback of the controller, and the blind community largely play on keyboards. So I had to have a game that where haptic feedback was a really cool addition to the experience, but it had to be able to be played on a keyboard. But one of the big feedback points I got in testing it is that I shouldn't assume that the community wouldn't want to buy a controller and experience this, and then there's a lot of advocates within the community saying, no, we want to encourage people in our community to do as many things like the sighted community is doing. So a friend of mine who's visually impaired wants to make sure that people consider getting a controller and trying the full experience, because that's going to open them up to playing on consoles and being in more spaces and making developers aware that they're there.
For sure. And where can people follow and learn more about the Vale?
We have a website. My company's Falling Squirrel, so fallingsquirrel.com. There's a link to the Vale page. It's fallingsquirrel.com, the Vale. And there we have you can sign up for a newsletter. We don't spam people. We'll just let you know when the game's out, essentially. That's what it's for, and give you some updates. And that's probably the main place to go. And Steam. Yeah, we have a Steam page. So wishlist us on Steam. That'll help us on launch for sure.